This learning module is going to build off of the cardiovascular anatomy, the pulmonary anatomy, physiology we've talked about, and really address what are the acute changes, the instant changes we see in the cardiovascular and pulmonary system with aerobic activity. And when we're talking about aerobic activity, we're talking about those exercises that use large muscle groups and are sustained for a long period of time. These are things like running, walking, biking, swimming, etc. Those really exercises that require oxygen for fuel, and our heart and lungs are really working hard to deliver the oxygen to produce ATP and etc. This will be all built around the Fick equation, or our equation for oxygen consumption. As you see, it's VO2 equals cardiac output times the arterial-venous difference. We can think about this equation in two different ways. The cardiac output is really about the central controller, the heart and the lungs, or I should say the heart pumping out that oxygenated blood, and the arterial-venous difference being the more peripheral controllers. These are the vessels, the muscles, how much oxygen we actually extract from the blood when it's delivered. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down each part of the Fick equation and talk about how exercise, aerobic exercise, impacts it. Let's start off with oxygen consumption. This is pretty straightforward, where as our demand on our body increases, as the intensity goes up, what do we see? We see an increase in oxygen consumption, and that's pretty straightforward. As we walk faster, run faster, swim faster, the demand on the oxygen system goes up, our body delivers more oxygen, we consume more oxygen to produce more energy. And the slope of that line, or the rate at which this line goes, and the upper point of this line is really based on our overall fitness level. So if we're extremely fit, we may be able to get to higher intensities and at a slower rate because we do a better job of delivering things. We'll talk more about those changes at a future lecture, but just to get that idea in your mind, or if we're very unfit, what you'll find is that the line is much more steep and we max out faster. So that's how we think about oxygen consumption changing with exercise intensity. Next, we can think about cardiac output. And you remember, cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. What happens during exercise? Well, we start exercising, our oxygen consumption goes up, and what we see is a linear increase in cardiac output to meet the oxygen demand. So as oxygen demand goes up, so does our cardiac output. And at rest, we might be putting out maybe 5 liters per minute. With activity, though, we might see that go up to 10, 15, 20, even 25 liters of blood being pumped out per minute based on our fitness level. So the more fit we are, the more blood our heart can pump out, and thus the more energy we can have for movement. So now let's break down cardiac output. Let's look at heart rate and stroke volume. What happens with heart rate? Well, we do see a linear increase in heart rate that takes place. So as oxygen consumption goes up, heart rate is going to go up with it. Now, the rate of which the heart goes up is based on our fitness level and how fit we are. In general, in a very general idea, we can say it goes up about 10 beats per minute per MET level. And that's an inactive client, someone who's not really in shape. And that's a very generality, but the key point is that it goes up with workload. How does it go up? It goes up based on the withdrawal of the parasympathetic input, but also the sympathetic system input. So let's look at that a little closer. I do like to make this point, though, that we only see that linear increase from for the average person, about 100 to 160 beats per minute. Down in this area here, this is going to be affected by nerves, chattering, laughter, your comfort with the person who's testing you or exercising with. This is what we see, someone gets on a treadmill and boom, their heart rate jumps up 20 beats per minute just by stepping on the treadmill. That's more the preparation of exercise. Whereas we get up top, up here near maximum levels, we see a leveling off because we see the maximum level, or the upper level that the oxygen delivery system reaches, and we lose that linear relationship. And this will be key when we talk about exercise testing later on in the semester. So let's look at that relationship again. So we already know that cardiac output goes up with oxygen consumption. We'll make that a blue line. And what do we know about heart rate? Well, we know heart rate is also a linear relationship. And up here we have our maximum heart rate. MHR is typically how you might see that listed. There is a way to predict someone's age-predicted maximum heart rate, and in your handout there are a couple equations. The most common one you see is 220 minus your age, and that's a very generality, and you can think about the 20-year-old. They're going to be 220 minus 20, of course that's simple, 200 beats per minute. But if you notice, it's plus or minus 12 beats per minute for just one standard deviation. So you might have someone who's actually, you get a 20-year-old, they might actually be 188, or they might be 212, and that's only, like I said, one standard deviation. If we go out to two standard deviations, actually that's double that. Heart rate, and this is a key point, that's why it's bolded in your handout, it's the most important factor for increasing cardiac output. So what determines our ability to increase cardiac output? It comes down to our ability of our heart to increase its beats per minute and pump more blood per minute. Now let's look at stroke volume. So again, this is the amount of blood that we pump with each beat, and you remember this from our talk in physiology. It's based on three different factors. We have the preload, how much blood's coming back to the heart, the contractility, how hard the heart's pumping, and then the afterload, the resistance to the blood flow. And remember, these preload and contractility are directly related to stroke volume, whereas afterload is inverse related to stroke volume. Afterload goes up, stroke volume goes down. During exercise, we see that stroke volume goes up because of these factors. Why does stroke volume go up? Well, first of all, you get more preloading. We have increased muscle pumping, we're running, we're pumping our legs, more blood's coming back to the heart, putting more of a preload on the heart. Contractility goes up. Why does contractility goes up? Well, it goes up because of more forceful contraction. We have catecholamine releases. We have the sympathetic system being triggered to cause more forceful contraction. We also have the Starling principle because of that preload, more forceful contractions. And then we get a decrease in the afterload with exercise, which causes the stroke volume to go up. Okay, so we have vasodilation throughout the system, total peripheral resistance goes down, making afterload go down, and stroke volume go up. We talked about this in the physiology lecture, but I do also want you to remember about the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a very important muscle. It is going up and down, pumping the blood up and down along the vena cava. So it's not just the peripheral muscles, the legs pumping blood back. Don't forget about the diaphragm. So let's go ahead and draw this out again. So we know cardiac output is a linear relationship to oxygen consumption. We know heart rate is a linear relationship. But stroke volume, actually, it's going to increase very, very quickly early on. So it's going to go up early on. And we see stroke volume leveling out as oxygen consumption goes up. And why does that happen? Well, you can only get so much blood back to the heart during those, as you get to later stages. So the blood's pumping back, we see an early increase take place, but then as we get to higher intensities, the heart's pumping faster and faster, there's less fill time, there's less time for diastole in between each beat. There is more blood coming back as we pump faster and faster, but we see that level off. If you remember about a minute ago, I said heart rate was the most important factor for increasing VO2, or the most important factor. Stroke volume, though, it's the most important factor for individual differences. And let's go back to our 20-year-old. All 20-year-olds, in a sense, will have a max heart rate of 200 beats per minute. Well, we know all 20-year-olds don't exercise at the same level. They don't get to the same VO2 max. What accounts for that difference? It comes down to stroke volume. So you might have one 20-year-old, their stroke volume looks like this. You have another, it looks like this. You have another, it might look like this. They can get to higher levels before their stroke volume levels off, and they get to higher overall total stroke volumes, and that can really account for those individual differences in exercise capacity. So we've talked about oxygen consumption goes up with exercise intensity, heart rate or cardiac output goes up with exercise intensity, heart rate goes up, all of those things happen linearly, stroke volume goes up, but it tends to have early increases and levels off as we go. And stroke volume is the most important for individual differences, whereas heart rate is the most important factor to determine the most important factor for increasing cardiac output. Let's move on to blood pressure. Let's talk about blood pressure. Remember this equation, cardiac output is equal to, or blood pressure is cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. Our body, all through exercise, is working to maintain a certain level of blood pressure. We need to get blood to the heart, the brain, and the skin, so we do that. What happens during exercises? Well, first of all, we get vasodilation around the working muscles. So there's triggers with local metabolic factors release. There's neural input to cause more blood flow to those legs and arms that we might be working. We get vasodilation to non-essential tissues, so less blood flow to our digestive system, our kidneys, our liver. We don't really necessarily need those to have a lot of blood during exercise. So what also happens is that our heart starts beating more forcefully, so our systolic pressure goes up. Let's put this together. So let's talk first about systolic pressure, and we'll do that one in red. It might start right here, and you'll see systolic pressure go up, 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 up with exercise. Typically it goes up about 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury per 1 met increase. Again, that's a generalization taking place. The key point is that it goes up. If exercise intensity goes down let me say that again. So if exercise intensity goes up and diastolic pressure does not go up, that's a concern. That's a red flag for exercise. We expect systolic pressure to go up with increased intensity. So that's the systolic pressure. Let's look at the diastolic pressure. Diastolic pressure will be down here in blue. Diastolic pressure should stay pretty even. It may go up a little bit or it may go down a little bit, but in general it's going to stay pretty much the same. So maybe about 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury change. Your handout says no more than a 10 millimeter mercury fluctuation, and that's a pretty fair estimate you'll see. Now if it changes 12, if it changes 15, are we that concerned? No, not really. If it starts changing 20 millimeters, either way, we get a little bit more concerned about that. But diastolic stays relatively the same. It might drop a little bit. Systolic is going up. And then afterwards, recovery, you'll see that line there. Just remember, too, that the blood pressure is going to slowly go down. So it takes a little bit of time for blood pressure to come back down after exercise. And then the same thing happens for the diastolic. You see leveling off there. Okay, if we had a third line in here for mean arterial pressure, that's going to go up with exercise and then go down like that. It's going to follow a little bit the systolic blood pressure. So the heart, we think about that as the engine that pumps things. What happens to coronary blood flow to the heart? Well, remember that the heart is extracting almost all the oxygen that's delivered to it at rest. So we cannot extract more oxygen during exercise as a way to improve blood oxygen delivery to the heart. It has to be about delivery. We have to deliver more blood to the heart. So how do we do that? We have our coronary vessels, as you see there and there. What happens? We get vasodilation takes place. So a lot of vasodilation taking place. Also understand that as the heart's beating, the heart squeezes. All these vessels get closed off during systole. The squeezing closes them off, and then they open back up, and during diastole, that's when the blood comes into the heart to deliver the oxygen to the cardiac muscle. You'll see in your handout I have a question for you. How do we measure oxygen demand on the heart? Remember we talked about the myocardial oxygen demand. We can also think about that as that's the delivery times the extraction of oxygen. And as we said, most of it, the extraction, we extract almost all the oxygen out. The non-invasive way to measure that, if you remember, would be looking at the double product or the rate pressure product. So double product or rate pressure product. Remember that's systolic blood pressure times heart rate. That's an indirect measurement of how hard the heart's working and thus how much blood flow it needs or oxygen needs to keep going. That's the coronary blood flow. Let's talk about peripheral blood flow. As you see from your handout, there's a big shift that takes place during exercise. You get a 10 to 20% times increase in the blood flow to active tissue. How do we do that? Well, we get vasodilation and vasoconstriction at different places. So this might be the legs right here, and this might be the liver right here. So you get vasoconstriction there, you get vasodilation here. Remember that the blood flow, you know this equation, is equal to change in pressure divided by the change in resistance. And remember, resistance is inversely related to the radius of the vessel, and that should be to the fourth power. So a small change in radius leads to a big change in resistance, which then leads to a big change in flow. So by adjusting the radius, by getting vasodilation, we can really change the oxygen delivery. Let's think about the blood distribution at rest. So we're resting, and let's say we're going to deliver about 5 liters of blood per minute. That's our cardiac output. If we look at that 5 liters as a pie piece, we might think, okay, the muscles might get 20-25% like that. You think about the liver, might get a big hunk of it like this. The heart always gets a little bit there, as you see. The brain gets a certain part of it like there, like so. And then the kidneys are getting a big hunk of it there. And then there's the other stuff over here. So the take-home point with this would be that the liver, the kidneys, and the other liver, kidneys, other getting a big portion of the blood flow. Okay, the muscles are too. I don't want to underrate the muscles, but they're maybe getting about 20% of the blood flow is going to the muscles. Now, what happens during exercise? Well, now you see the circle's a lot bigger, so maybe we're getting 20 to 25 liters of blood per minute as our cardiac output. How that changes is we see that muscle is getting almost, it's going from 20% to maybe 80% of the pie. So there's a big shift that takes place, and the muscles get most of the blood flow at that point. Here, we see the liver goes down, the kidneys go down. Brain will always be the same, maybe not percentage-wise, but the brain needs a certain volume of oxygen. So if you look at some textbooks, it'll say the brain maybe gets only 4% of the blood flow during exercise. Well, that's overall blood flow, because this is going up so high, it may only be 4%, but it's still getting the certain number of milliliters, the certain amount of oxygen that it needs to keep going. But the take-home point with this is that you see a big shift from blood going to the muscles, from the liver and the kidneys at rest, more to the muscles and the heart and those things that we need for oxygen transport during activity. Other things we see that takes place with activity, you see an increased extraction of oxygen by the muscles. So maybe at rest, we're delivering, first of all, you see we deliver more blood during activity. So if that's going up, delivery is going up, but also what's going up is the extraction. So we have 2 mechanisms we're using to increase oxygen delivery to the muscles themselves: increased extraction and increased delivery. If we think about this, let's say we'll put arterial system like this. This is the oxygen in the arterial system, and then we'll look at the venous system in blue, and we see that oxygen levels, not much of a change. We haven't extracted that much oxygen from the arterial system, because we look at, there's a fair amount of oxygen still left in the venous system. Now, if we look at it during exercise, we see oxygen in the arterial system's up like this, but then the oxygen in the venous system is going to be down like this, or even down like that, depending on how much we're exercising. So there's a much bigger extraction during exercise than we might see at rest. So we know the muscles are extracting more oxygen, but what's also going on in the muscles themselves? Well, you see that there is a better insulin sensitivity, so they're taking up glucose better. They're using aerobic mechanisms for energy. We'll talk about how that changes a little bit more. Ideally, you want to use the aerobic mechanisms, but as intensity gets higher and higher, there is a shift to more anaerobic mechanisms, because the aerobic mechanism cannot keep up. And then you get a buildup of lactate and carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions. The muscles become more acidic because of that. And what we see a buildup of lactate levels. So as oxygen consumption goes, we might have oxygen consumption start off down here, and as we get going, you see it goes this way. There's always some lactate in the muscles, for sure, as a byproduct, but we hit a point where we can't get rid of that lactate, and we see what happens. We see an upward peak of lactate happens, and this is the lactic threshold. So as we hit a point where the lactate builds up, we were more dependent on anaerobic system, and then we have a harder time getting rid of those byproducts of metabolism, we see that build up. And this might be the point you start feeling pain, discomfort, muscle soreness comes on at this point where that lactate builds up in the muscles. Someone who's more fit, they might be able to go, first of all, start with the lower levels, and they might be able to go longer before they go up. Whereas the person who's not very fit, they may go here, and they might go up sooner when they start to experience that lactic level increase based on their fitness level. In your handout, you see typically it's about 55% of VO2 max, and that's a generalization. It might differ from person to person. We have gotten through what happens to the heart with exercise. We've talked about cardiac output and stroke volume and heart rate. We've talked about the vasculature with vasodilation. We've talked about the muscles with better oxygen extraction. We've talked a little bit about buildup of byproducts. Now let's move on to the pulmonary system. What happens to our lungs? This is one of those equations I told you to make sure you memorize. Minute ventilation, that's based on respiratory rate and tidal volume, breaths per minute, and how much air we bring in per breath. Very similar to the cardiac output equation of stroke volume times heart rate. What we see in the pulmonary system is that as we start to exercise, a few changes happen. And we go back to that equation. We see that first off, tidal volume is going to increase early on. So we get an increase in tidal volume first. If you think about it, it's easier to take a deeper breath than it would be to take another breath and another breath. If we can just bring in more air with each breath, that's a good accommodation. As exercise becomes more and more intense, we see the respiratory rate then go up to deliver more ventilation. So we see that change happens. At the same time, we have to remember the muscles in the pulmonary system. As our diaphragm, intercostal muscles fire and work to get air in and out of the lungs, their oxygen demand goes up too. So their VO2 goes up, their O2 consumption goes up. So we have to deliver more oxygen to those muscles to do the actual work. So we have to, in a sense, pay the pulmonary system to help us bring that oxygen in and out. We can't use that oxygen at the working muscles necessarily, at the legs, at the arms, because we have to keep the pulmonary system going. If we think about minute ventilation and oxygen consumption, how this typically looks is you have a line, very linear, and then you might hit a point here where that line starts to curve a little bit and go up a little sharper. And you think about why would your minute ventilation go higher and higher? Why would that slope of that line change? Well, it comes down to the pulmonary threshold. You hit a certain threshold where you have to get rid of more of the byproducts. So think about the lactic acid threshold or blood lactate threshold. We might be hitting very similar at the same point here. We have more byproducts, so we have to increase the respiratory rate or increase the minute ventilation to get rid of those byproducts of metabolism. And you might have recognized this in yourself. As you hit higher intensities, you feel like you're breathing harder and harder and harder, and all of a sudden it just kind of comes on, you're breathing harder. That has to deal with your body's trying to get rid of those byproducts and then bring in more oxygen at the same time. Other changes we see in the pulmonary system, as you see in your handout, increased levels of oxygen in the alveoli. You're taking deeper breaths. There's more of a mismatch or driving pressure between the blood in the pulmonary circulation in their lungs for oxygen and carbon dioxide. It allows for better gas exchange or faster gas exchange too. The heart's beating more forcefully, so the right side of the heart's pumping that blood more forcefully into the lungs for better gas exchange. Let's switch over and talk about just energy systems we're using during exercise. So if you think about exercise in general, early on, when we first start an activity, we are using more the ATP system, ATP creatine phosphate system. That just gets us going. That's the energy just stored in the muscle itself. Then we have the glycolytic system, which is helping us at this point here, maybe even a little bit further, I would say. This is energy that we can create pretty quickly. We can make it anaerobic or aerobic. We can use pyruvate and go through that whole process there. That's helping us get through things until we can get to the point in which we have the oxidative system that we use for aerobic activity. So you have ATP system, or I should say that's not the way we should say it. We should say it's more the oxidative system or the aerobic system. So even though the activity may be aerobic in nature, early on we rely on those anaerobic systems to get us going. So we're using more stored energy or energy that we can quickly make at this point until the oxidative system can kick in about 2 minutes into activity. If we think about oxygen deficit and exercise post-oxygen consumption, this ties into the idea of energy systems. Let's say we're doing an activity, and let's say that activity costs us about 7 mets. We'll just pick an activity like that. Our oxygen consumption just doesn't shoot up right up to 7 mets like that. That's not how the system works. It takes a little bit more time to get the system going. So we go back to here. What actually happens is we see a slow, gradual increase as oxygen consumption catches up, and then we level off at 7 minutes. And this might be about 2 minutes before that happens. So from this point here, we are relying on the anaerobic systems to do this. Now from this point on, if we keep it at 7 mets and we're fit and it's not our VO2 max or anything, we can, in theory, continue indefinitely at 7 mets. We might hit a point that fatigue comes on, etc., but if we have everything working well, we can just continue doing the 7 met activity. Well, that doesn't happen, right? We eventually stop. We might end exercise right here. What happens at that point? Oxygen consumption just doesn't go like that. It just doesn't all of a sudden stop and go down. No, what happens, again, it's a gradual decline. Okay, so it takes over time before we go down like that. And what that is, we're paying back that oxygen debt. So we borrowed over here, we're taking this here, and we're helping to clear byproducts. We're also reestablishing the glycogen in the muscles, the ATP in the muscles, and we're going back and we're repaying that debt from over here. So we use those anaerobic systems there, and now we have to reestablish those energy stores and do it that way. Now someone who's more fit, so this might have been our person before, like this. Someone who's more fit, let's say, they might be able to go up just a little bit steeper, do it this way, and then they may recover a little bit faster. Or someone who's a little bit more out of shape, they may take a little bit longer to get up there. They go this way, and their recovery period's a lot longer. So as we become more fit, that's going to change a little bit. But I want you to think about the idea that heart rate and blood pressure, all those things are gradual changes. We get up to that VO2 that we need at that level. We stop activity, and then we gradually go back. As you learned about earlier in the semester, we know that fat has more energy per gram than carbon dioxide. So it makes more sense for us to use fat for energy if we can. The downside of using fat, though, is it takes time to break down. We have to go through multiple steps to convert it to get it to the point that we can use it to create ATP. So it takes longer to use. So at rest, what we see is that if fat is orange, as you see here, early on we use a lot of fat at rest. Okay, so we use more fat for energy at rest because we have time to break it down. As exercise becomes more and more intense, we use less and less fat. And what's happening is we're switching over to using carbon dioxide. And let me take that back. Not carbon dioxide, we're using carbohydrate to provide our energy. So at rest, again, it's mostly fat, but then we use more carbohydrate, more carbohydrate, more carbohydrate, more and more, into the point we get to our VO2 max or near our max, and we switch over to really using the carbohydrate for most of our energy. How do we look at that? We look at that through a measure called RER, or respiratory exchange ratio. And that's the ratio of carbon dioxide that we exhale to the oxygen that we use. So how much oxygen we bring in versus how much carbon dioxide we exhale. Early on at rest, our O2 is going to be greater than our CO2. Okay, and that just shows us that we're using more fat for energy. We're going through the process to break down the fat to create ATP. It takes more oxygen. As we start exercising more and more and more, we're unable to use the fat, so we switch over to more carbon dioxide for our energy production. And what we see with that, there's a more one-to-one relationship. So we use 1 molecule of oxygen, and we tend to produce 1 molecule or 1 unit of carbon dioxide in exchange. So that RER gets higher and higher and higher until we get to more one-to-one, where we're using purely carbon dioxide for energy at that point. We'll talk during exercise testing of reasons why the RER might go above 1. That's to come at a later point. Also, we think about the neurosystem. We think about the involvement with aerobic exercise, and we're going to erase that out actually, so that's all clear. We think about our natural heart rhythm, as you remember, is about that 90 to 100 beats per minute. When we think about that, that's our natural rhythm of our heart. We have our parasympathetic system over here, which is keeping the heart rate low. So that's really active. And then what happens as we start exercising, the sympathetic system kicks in to bring our heart rates up to where it needs to be. So there's that balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. The parasympathetic system removes some of the stimulus on the heart, allow the heart rate to go up, and then the sympathetic system will kick in to increase the heart rate even further. Other things we see happen in the body, we have release of epinephrine, norepinephrine, helps contractility go up, causes vasodilation throughout the system, helps with that fight or flight response in a sense. We also have endorphins that are released, and these, we talk about runner's high, where people feel really good after high-intensity activity. That's where the endorphins come in when we think about those hormonal releases. If you remember the renin-angiotensin system, this process where the kidneys might get this sympathetic stimulation, we go through the process of renin, angiotensin 1, 2, and what we have happen in the acute stages, we have sympathetic vasoconstriction. In response to that, we also have some changes from fluid retention and those sort of things, but more instantaneously, you get that vasoconstriction throughout the system during exercise. Now let's move on to what's limiting performance. We talked about how all the different systems kick in to help us to improve oxygen delivery during aerobic activity. What happens when we hit that max level? What limits us? So if we think about a chain in a sense, or the links, these are all the different things that could be the limiting factor. It could be lung ventilation, lung diffusion, cardiac muscle, the delivery of the blood itself, the extraction. There's a lot of different things that could go wrong in the system. It's a complex system. Well, the traditional model says it's cardiac output. Cardiac output's our limiting factor. We just can't pump enough blood to get it out there. The lungs could still oxygenate the air. The muscles could extract more oxygen if we could get the oxygen there. It's just that the cardiac muscle can't pump any further. What should be pointed out, though, that with the cardiac muscle, we shouldn't be experiencing ischemia at max level. Okay, so the cardiac muscle has enough oxygen in a sense. Its supply and demand are met. The theory is, though, it just can't pump anymore. Okay, so you shouldn't feel ischemia at maximum level unless there's some cardiac pathology going on. So the traditional model says it's just the heart. The heart's the limiting factor. You can't pump any more blood. Now, there are different models out there. Some people will show in very elite athletes that maybe it's the pulmonary system that's limiting. And those people have had a lot of cardiac adaptations, and their heart can pump, and then it's the pulmonary system that's more limiting. Don't forget the central governor model. We brought that up a couple lectures ago. This idea that it's really the brain that might be limiting. The brain causes the stimulation of fatigue, and it makes us slow down. It makes us want to stop doing things as a protective mechanism, that if we just kept going, we might injure ourselves or affect the homeostasis of the body. It's the brain, in a sense, that limits our activity. The true answer of what limits activity is probably variable for the person. It's a combination of all the systems. We can't just pin it on one system and generalize that to everybody. For some athletes, some individuals, they may be able to work through all the sensations of fatigue and all of these psychological factors and push themselves to the limits to the point that their heart just can't do anything more, their lungs can't do anything more. Others individuals, the brain kicks in and gives them senses of fatigue or different stimulus, and they decide to stop moving, to stop pushing themselves to protect their body from damage. Let's talk a little bit about static versus dynamic activity. If we just do static activity where we're using isometric contractions, this can be dangerous for some individuals actually. What happens is the person, in a sense, is holding their breath, or they're going through and contracting their muscles very tightly. That limits stroke volume. That limits venous return, which can cause stroke volume to go down. It could cause the blood pressure to go up and the heart rate to go up in response. And then all of a sudden, the person stops holding the isometric contraction, or they let go of their Valsalva maneuver, where they're holding their breath, compressing the vena cava. All that blood comes rushing back to their heart, causing the blood pressure to go up, their heart rate to go up. It's not a good situation. And that's why dynamic activity is so much better for us as human beings. We're meant to be moving. We're not really designed to do a lot of static, high-intensity work. So when we're moving our legs, our arms, moving in a dynamic fashion, that's better for us. We get better pumping back to the heart. Blood pressure changes are less. It's a much, much safer response. So ideally, we want to be doing dynamic exercise. If we think about acute changes that happen during arm versus leg activity, what we find, there's a different heart rate response. Legs overall will produce a higher VO2 max. So we think about arms and legs, okay? VO2 max is going to be greater for the legs. Why is that? Well, they're bigger muscles. We can extract more oxygen. We can deliver more oxygen overall, so our oxygen consumption is going to be greater. But what about responses that we see at the same workload? So if we're at a 5 MET level, let's say we're at 5 METs on the arms versus the legs, what we see is a greater heart rate response with arm activity versus leg activity. So the arm muscles, they're smaller. You have to work against gravity to hold them up. They're more postural based. It's harder on the body to do 5 METs of activity on the arms versus doing it with the legs. So what does that mean? We can't take an exercise test. Let's say we do an exercise test and we figure out someone's VO2 max is 10 METs and we use the bike for that, or running on the treadmill. If we train them with the arm ergometer, we can't really use that exercise test because it's going to lead to an overestimation of the intensity at which they can tolerate. They're not going to be able to get to a 10 MET level on their arms just like they did with the legs. So the take-home point is specificity of testing and training. If you want to train on the arms, you got to do an exercise test using the arms. If you want to train with the legs, you do it with the legs. If we think about the arms versus the leg exercise response, we'll make the legs be a black line like so. We see this is the VO2 max in a sense, so the highest oxygen consumption we get to. If we look at the arms being blue, we see here at the same MET level, or the same workload, what do we see? We see a difference right there in between the responses that we might get. So you might see a higher heart rate response at that same workload, and then you also might see just an overall oxygen consumption to do that same workload. But then you also notice that the legs are going to get to a higher overall workload as opposed to the arms too. So take-home point, don't use exercise tests from the lower extremity, just at the intensity of the upper, and then upper extremity tests will not lead to a true maximum heart rate. You might max out before, you might get fatigued, I should say, before you get to that upper heart rate. We'll talk more about that in one of our labs when we do exercise testing. Questions, obviously you can't ask me a question because this is a recording, but think about your questions, bring them to class when we talk about it, and as in other classes, you see some thought questions to help guide you to go back and review this material with.